So this is an example of monocorrelation in a non-Christian context. Let us now go to the next step. What is then recontextualization? And how does recontextualization of Catholic faith and school identity looks like? How can we bring it to our schools? And the first thing we want to say is that recontextualization is a daily event. Recontextualization is in fact the description of a formal process whereby something is placed in a new context and receiving through that new context renewed meaning and plausibility. This happens every day, everywhere. So people often say to me, but you're using such a difficult academic words, recontextualization, what is that? We cannot do that, that's too difficult, we don't know what it is. Well, we do this every day. It's a daily event. I'll give some examples. Look, for example, how train stations of municipal administrative services are reconstructing their buildings. They are not only reconstructing their buildings, but they create a new context to receive people. The way administration deals with us today is much different from how it happened 25 years ago. The administration recontextualizes itself. We have seen Coca-Cola. We have looked into the mottos of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola changes every year its motto. It has been always Coca-Cola. Enjoy Coca-Cola. Very interesting. It has been one year real. Real, the ontological referent, real. The year after, make it real. And for the moment, it is open happiness. Open happiness. So they recontextualize the combination of happiness and consumption. Also, the shape of the bottle of Coca-Cola has been recontextualized over the years, but in such a way that everybody is able to continue to recognize that it's a bottle of Coca-Cola. And that's wonderful. People today immediately see that's a bottle of Coca-Cola, but the form has changed. It's a process of recontextualization. To give other examples, complete other example, the meaning of 9/11, for example, if you look to the history of the reception of 9/11, it has been changed over the years. Think about our emotional reactions immediately after the attacks. Look to 9/11 after the war in Iraq. Look to it after the re-election of George Bush. Look to it after the election of Barack Obama. Look to it after the death of Osama bin Laden. The meaning of 9/11 has been recontextualized. It has shifted at the moment that the context has shifted. So recontextualization is not a burden for Catholic schools. It's a human dynamic as such. That's the first thing we want to say. Think about the example of Jan, who just became a father. With the birth of your first child, I have to read what I said down. It's too long ago for me. It changed the context and the nature of a marriage. Yeah? That you need as a couple to reinvent yourself and your love at the moment that a child comes in. Or even a more simple example, if you renovate your living room, it's a process of recontextualization. It changes the relations. It's changed how you feel, how you orientate yourself in the rooms of your own house. So the first thing we want to say is recontextualization is a daily event, not specific for Catholic school identity. It can happen everywhere. Why would we not be able to do this? Now, what are some characteristics of recontextualization? That's the next step. A first characteristic is what we call with Gadamer, the philosopher of hermeneutics, the fusion of horizons. The fusion of horizons. What do we mean by that? We mean by that in a good recontextualization, the old, the tradition, and the new penetrate each other, create a new unity. It's not like a pizza Hawaii where you can pick out the pineapple. Recontextualization is characterized by a deeper encounter between tradition and contemporary life. For that reason, of course, to recontextualize, you need post-critical believers who have the experience from within they can recontextualize. Someone in relativism cannot recontextualize Catholic faith. And someone in literal belief won't be prepared to do it. So, recontextualization is a very intimate and creative interaction between the text and the context, between the tradition and the situation of today. So these two things are in some way fused in a new unity in such a way that the original components cannot be separated from each other anymore. That is what happens in recontextualization. That's a much deeper process than a values education. Yeah, we could compare it with making a soufflé. Yeah? If you're cooking, you create something new by putting together ingredients. Yeah? And if you have a soufflé, you can no longer split the original ingredients from each other. So cooking is an act of recontextualization. You fuse things and you create a new synthesis. Yeah, in the car driving to the hotel, we changed cooking is an act of recontextualization into cooking can be an act of recontextualization. You know why? Because Paul Pollefeyt told us that he knows someone, I will not name her, yeah, who just only repeats what is in the textbook for cooking. Yeah? And then cooking is an act of reconfessionalization. You just reproduce the same. Yeah? And he's saying, Paul, if I'm cooking, I always do it myself, I put things together, and the smell is always different. So if you recontextualize, you have never two times the perfect same dish. Yeah? It's always unique, it's always creative, there's always born a new synthesis out of the encounter, the deep encounter of the original ingredients. If you cook as a chef, you need to use good ingredients. Applied to our situation, that's a good use of the Catholic tradition. Yeah, if my wife makes a soufflé, she's always saying, yeah, I'm not sure, it can go wrong. Cooking is a risky thing. Recontextualization also. Yeah? I will give examples of that too. So that's the first important characteristic, which is different from values education. In recontextualization, the horizons are encountering each other, yeah, in a deep, personal way. Oh yeah, we have several examples with us. That's the first example. It's a piece of art. It's called Homeless Jesus. Homeless Jesus. You see a man in a park laying down. But what is special on the man, you see his feet. They bear the stigmata of Christ. It's Christ who is laying down there. You cannot make something else of it. So the context of the park somewhere in Melbourne and the figure of Jesus are meeting each other here in such an overwhelming way that you can no longer separate from each other. This piece of art has become the origin of a big controversy in the United States because several churches refused the piece of art because it's too shocking. because the encounter, in my terms then, between text and context is too intimate. Finally, the piece of art found its place in a foyer of a Jesuit school, secondary school in the United States, where this has found its final place. So recontextualization is a deep meeting between text and context, as you can see in this piece of art. That's a good example. Yeah, then we have another picture. That's a school we saw this week. And yeah, that's what we call a not succeeded form of recontextualization. So what have they done? They have put images of the Eucharist at the bottom, and on the top they have made, I don't know what it is, flowers or butterflies. Yeah. They have put them above, but there is no intrinsic link between the two. In fact, they are foreign to each other. And of course, in a school where kids are confessionally initiated, you can have a connection between the fun and the beauty and the happiness on the one hand and the Eucharist on the other hand, but the link between the two is an external link. There is no intrinsic encounter between the two. Even if the person who made this, we spoke with him, and it's with great respect that I refer to him. We had a very nice talk together. Try to do this as an example of recontextualization. He was convinced it's a form of recontextualization because you put the Eucharist in the context of the happy full life of the children. But it's more monocorrelation. Think about the Coca-Cola, and you can just leave out the Eucharist and continue with the butterflies when you leave the school. There is no encounter. There's no dialogue between the two. And that's why we say that this is rather an example of values education. That is an example of a good example of recontextualization. Jan put it there a little bit ironically, as you can see, decorated First Communion. It's put a decor around the First Communion. So that's the first characteristic of recontextualization. That's the link between the two should be internal and not external. The second characteristic of recontextualization is what we call multi-correlation. Multi-correlation. So I have spoken about correlation as making a link between daily life and the Christian story. Remember? So recontextualization is not against correlation. I love correlation. Why? Because correlation is nothing else than the didactical translation of the theological concept of incarnation. You know, central in Christianity is God became man in the person of Jesus. In fact, that's an act of correlation. God correlates to the world. God relates himself to the world. God takes hands and feet in the person of Jesus. That's a correlative act. So Christians cannot be against correlation. The problem is not correlation. The problem is that we have reduced correlation to a strategy to close the hermeneutical space with just one meaning that suffocates the work of the Spirit in the hermeneutical space. So multi-correlation is the alternative for monocorrelation. Yeah? So my position is not less but more correlation than before. And now I will explain the same thing academically. The human experience is to be interpreted in several ways. The Catholic tradition can be interpreted in manifold ways. And also our society tries to seduce us. Yeah? The whole society, the whole economic world, the whole commercial world, the whole media is one big seduction. Please correlate with me, with my mobile phone, with my Coca-Cola, with my new computer. Yeah? the hermeneutical space is full of seductions of correlation. So we need children, young people, to enable to discern how to deal with that multitude of correlations. And we are not doing that by always presenting them just one correlation, of which we know that they will reject it at the end of their secondary school periods. So it's also important to see that interpretation is not only related to the text. It means we have to interpret the Christian tradition, that's true. But we have also to interpret, to read our context today. What happens with ecology, with biodiversity, for example. And thirdly, we have also to know that we have to interpret ourselves. We have to reflect on how we ourselves are interpreting the world. I refer to all what happens within the hermeneutical space. So it's more than interpreting texts. It's interpreting context, and it's interpreting the interpreting subject itself. Conclusion: today, it will be increasingly difficult to fixate young people in one dominant, imposed correlation. Young people exist in a powerful, you cannot underestimate that they live in a very powerful hermeneutical field. They receive a tremendous amount of input and are seduced to comply with meanings offered everywhere. Moreover, today the subject is very deconstructive. It will perceive clearly when institutions, not only the church, but institutions try to impose meanings within the hermeneutical space. And on the other hand, what is positive is that people enjoy also the wealth of meanings. It's a blessing to live in our times, because our hermeneutical space is so enriched with all what happens in this world. So life, you could say, is intrinsically multi-correlational, and recontextualization should also enable to work with that multi-correlative process, as it were. We have an example of that. Jan, will you explain the example?
Sure. Yeah. This is an example of an architectural recontextualization of a boarding room in a secondary college in Belgium, again a Jesuit school. You see a classical painting of Saint Xaverius, who is evangelizing in India. And the painting is thoughtfully integrated in a modern interior design. It's large and notable, standing at the center, freestanding against the back wall and lit from behind, central in this space. And as well in the manifold conversations that take place in that room. The school leadership hopes to keep the traditional story that is behind the name and the tradition of the school, to keep the story alive and central in the policy decisions that are made in this room. So again, by placing this old-fashioned painting in a new context, it appears to the people in the room in a new way, penetrating the discussions and the meetings and the thoughts of the people gathering there.
Okay. So, fusion of horizons, multi-correlation. A third important element of recontextualization is the attention for the particularity of the Catholic faith. While Christian values education, the next slide, yeah. While Christian values education looks for the lowest common denominator, a kind of compromise between Catholics and non-believers, recontextualization stresses stronger the particularity of the Catholic faith. Yeah. So not only Christmas is a universal experience of a child that is born, but also Easter, which you cannot explain in human terms, that God gives new life to the death. Not only speaking about life after death for the soul, but also the resurrection of the body, for example. What does that mean in the context of today, where the body is or has become so vulnerable? Not only speaking about love, but also to speak about love for the enemy. So recontextualization asks that we not only go from experience to Christian faith, but that sometimes we also take the opposite route, going from Catholic faith. I'm sorry, I'm confusing always Catholic and Christian. That's because in Belgium these are synonyms. That's not the case here. Catholic faith to experience as well. So at certain points, we need to allow for an input in the hermeneutical space. It must be possible to present new content in a deductive way. After all, Jesus Christ should remain a crucial component in all communication, education, and learning. This in contrast with Christian values education, where often one thinks that you always can take faith out of experience or from the remaining Catholic confessionality. Because you see, it's a model more than Christian values education that not only looks to the universal, but also to the particular. Last characteristic of recontextualization is, of course, interaction with the context. So in the reconfessionalization, one uses only references that are internal to the Catholic tradition, without taking the context in the dynamic or in the dialogue. It's an inner Christian theory of references. If you see that, you can say it's reconfessionalization. In recontextualization, in some way, the context is included in the interaction that is set up. We have also here some examples to explain this to you. Jan?
That's for you.
I should do it, okay. That's a picture that has been taken in Leuven during Christmas time. They have created a kind of new bus stop with two parents and a child. And it's in fact, it's a Christmas presentation. But you see how the context and the text of the tradition are meeting each other here in this presentation of the Christmas story in one of the corners of the city of Leuven. Joseph, Maria and baby Jesus at Leuven bus stop. So you see again the encounter between text and context.